conversation series in conversation with Jez Groom and April. Welcome. I am Raj Singh, your host for the day. I'm chairman for Institute of Directors Berkshire, and I would be working on behalf of you to make sure that we get the maximum out of Jez and April's time today. Before I start this, I will just like to give you a bit of order of service today. We will be starting today with basically introducing Jez and April, and then we will go through a couple of conversations with them, and around 9:30 we will open the floor for your questions. If you type your questions into the chat box, what we will do is we'll pick up the questions from there and we'll carry on till about 9:55. And from 9:55 onwards, we will thank and we will formally close the session at 10 o'clock. There's a networking event after 10 o'clock. So those who have opted in for the networking event can stay back after that point. So again, a formal welcome and good morning. Just to let you know that we are recording this conversation, so it has been already notified to you, but again, to re-emphasize that we are recording this conversation. In today's conversation, basically, Jez and April will be focusing a lot around their book, which is Ripple. And on behalf of all of you, first of all, Jez and April, a very warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Jez Groom has been practicing behavioral science for over 10 years, working with some of the biggest organizations around the world. And he was the co-founder of Google with Change and Engine Decisions. In 2016, he founded Cowrie Consulting, the leading behavioral economics consultancy, and is currently a visiting fellow of behavioral science at City University. April Vellacott is one of our youngest speakers in this series. I'm glad that she is in. And also she is the first female speaker in our series, and it's only by coincidence, not by design, I must admit. So April has been studying in the field of human behavior for nearly a decade and holds a degree in psychology and behavioral change. She was a behavioral consultant at Cowrie Consulting till last week, where she has helped global clients apply behavioral science in their organizations. So Jez and April, welcome again, and please may I start having conversation with you at this Institute of Directors Conversation Series. And the first thing I want to really ask you is, what really prompted both of you to write this book?
Thanks, Raj. Thanks for the intro as well. It's nice to have it done for us rather than doing it ourselves. And yeah, I mean, it's been quite a journey with behavioral science over the last 50 years or so. And with Jez and my combined experience of applying it in the world of business, we kind of saw that there had been these three major stepping stones, if you will, in the kind of evolution of behavioral science up until where we're at right now. So the first step kind of began around the 1970s, and you had people like Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. So they're like the big celebrity names in the world of behavioral science. They started transforming this field of economics and forming this brand new field called behavioral economics, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of and know a lot about already. So as you know, economics is all about assuming that we are completely rational. We always try and maximize our utility. So basically for every decision we make, we're doing this kind of cost benefit analysis, and we're choosing the path which is the right outcome for us. But as I'm sure you guys will know, that's not how we all make decisions. And so that's where they started forming this field of behavioral economics. So it's where we behave in ways that are predictably irrational. And there are all of these different social and emotional and psychological things that influence how we make decisions. So to give an example that you guys might have heard of, there was a study done in 2003, ages ago now, by Eric Johnson and Dan Goldstein, and they were looking at the power of defaults. So, you know, in particular, they found that being opted in to organ donation by default dramatically increased organ donation. So this is the idea that we are inherently lazy and we like to go with the flow, and defaults have this really powerful effect on our behavior. So this was the first step, all about developing the academic field of behavioural science. And you may have seen that Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in 2002 for all of this amazing body of work that he contributed to. And the second big step we kind of seen over the last 10 years or so, really, so still very recent. And this is about how we apply behavioural science in like public policy in this kind of context. So this kind of kicked off with this book, Nudge, by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, which again, I'm sure lots of you will probably have seen on the bookshelves or probably even read. And it's all about how we can redesign our environments in these kind of tiny ways that actually change people's behaviour. And they're kind of better known as nudges now. So the word nudge has kind of entered the kind of popular vernacular, and we're all talking about it. So this is where we kind of started to think about, you know, how we might nudge people to pay their taxes on time or save more money into their pensions. So here we're kind of applying the thing that I just talked about, like default bias, to get people to maybe save more money into their pensions. So having people automatically opted in, as you may know, radically increases pension contributions. So this was all about, you know, applying behavioural science in the public sector. And it seemed, you know, many people who'd read Nudge were kind of left thinking, well, what next? You know, how do I apply all of this amazing stuff in my own life? And how do I apply it in a business context? Like, it's clear that there are loads of amazing insights here. How can I use this to help my job and help the business? And I know that I was thinking that, at least when I was doing my master's in behaviour change, which was only 3 years ago now. And I was thinking, you know, how is this really being applied in the real world and in the private sector? And there wasn't really anything out there that kind of really lifted the lid on that. And that's where we're at today. So this kind of brings us to this amazing third big step in the evolution of behavioural science. And that's why Jez and I wrote Ripple. So there are so many experiences in the world around us which aren't designed very well. Lots of them designed by businesses. And that's where behavioural science can really help. So what we wanted to do with Ripple was we wanted to democratise this really interesting world so that everyone can do it. And we wanted to give people a kind of practical guidebook for how they could start applying behavioural science in the world of business. And it's really timely, actually. It's the kind of perfect handbook right now, because we're kind of starting to see mass adoption. We're kind of at the very early stages of everyone kind of starting to do this. So it's, I mean, we're biased, obviously, but we think it's a really useful handbook for anyone who wants to start applying behavioural science in their business and doesn't quite know where to start.
I have noticed a very different format in your book, you know, small chapters. Normally we look at 8 to 10 chapters, you know, before even half of your book is you go through, there are already 10 chapters there. Similarly, I look at very small sections, I look at small paragraphs, and quite amazingly in 2 pages, it's not unusual in your book to look at 2 or 3 sections within the 2 pages. Very refreshing approach, I must admit, very, I would say, encouraging for people with low IQ like me to read the book. But why this refreshing approach? It's a very difficult subject. I wouldn't say difficult, it's a complex subject, to put it mildly. And why did you take this very different kind of approach? I'm just thinking that it could have worked against you as well. It could have looked like a very casual book rather than something very serious to do with behavioral science. Why did you take this?
Well, we're really glad you noticed, Raj. And yeah, one of the most, it was one of the most valuable things that a professor ever said to my whole class, actually, when we were doing our undergraduate degree in psychology. So I was at St Andrews, and the professor said, look, guys, you know, you are not stupid. Like each of you is here for a reason. And if you read an academic paper and it doesn't land and it doesn't go in, it's not your fault. It's the way they've written it. So you're not stupid. you're at this institution for a reason. It's the way the paper's been written. So don't be disheartened, basically. And anyone who's kind of started to read the academic papers, or even kind of picked up Thinking Fast and Slow, which you've probably seen dotted around airport bookshop shelves all over the place. They're really, really dense, it's filled with really, really interesting stuff, but you have to try really hard to kind of get to the nuggets of insight. Jez kind of tells this story about how obviously you can't tell how much people read of an actual book in person, but Kindle has all this amazing data about how much people actually like highlight of a book. So it's quite a good proxy for seeing how engaged people are when they're going through a book. And interestingly, Thinking Fast and Slow, everyone says they've read it, but what the Kindle data was showing, that people are actually only highlighting into just 6% of the book, which is tiny, really. And it's so ironic, because the book's all about how to. It's all about these insights about the mental shortcuts that we all use, but they're not actually using them to make it easier for people to read. So what we wanted to do, we made a really conscious decision when we were writing Ripple, that we wanted to practice what we preach, basically. So we wanted to apply the behavioral science to the book itself to make it really easy to digest, and easy for people to take those insights into their life and applying it in business. So we did a few things. We know that when we're faced with too much information, we essentially go into cognitive overload, which basically means our brains shut down and don't process everything that they're reading. So what we wanted to do is we chunked the chapters into shorter sections. We deliberately chose a font that was easy for our brains to process. And we used really simple language, you said, Raj, that, that there's a danger that people might think we were kind of oversimplifying it and dumbing it down. But actually what we know is that when we use shorter sentences and avoid jargon, people find information more believable and more memorable. So we made a really conscious decision to do that. And we also wanted to make the most important information in the book really salient, right? So rather than letting the insights get lost amongst all the text, we wanted to pull out the learnings from each chapter at the very end, to give you clean insights that you could use, and you can easily glance back to find the bits that you need. And we've had great feedback about how easy it is to read, which I didn't know whether we should be offended by it. Sometimes these Amazon reviews about how easy it was to read, but it's what we set out to do. We wanted to make it a really, really easy to digest. And I mean, it's exactly the same lens that we apply at Cowrie when we're helping clients to do anything from like designing an email through to the whole user experience that someone might go through online. We're thinking about how our visual systems process information and how we can use design and other principles from behavioral science to make it as effortless for our brains to process as possible.
So April, I must admit, out of sheer loyalty to Malcolm Gladwell, I read Thinking Hard, Thinking Fast all the way through. Also because I read all his books as well. And as I said, personal loyalty was important for me because he used to be one of our keynote speakers. Every third year or something like that, we'll bring him for a keynote speech. But I must say that it was slightly difficult for a normal business person to go through the whole book. You're absolutely right. And I already see some of our colleagues writing in the chat box. It's very easy to read your book. That brings me to the other tricky question, which is people always associate nudge with bad press. Basically, a lot of people have almost started saying that the behavioral scientists are using it for unethical practices. And in today's digital world, if you really see, I consider social media like a missile launcher. And behavioral science is almost like a nuke on the top of it. So using social media, you can launch that nuclear missile of behavioral science and unleash terror in the world of political behaviors, social behaviors, and of course, all of us know elections and whatnot.
Yeah.
In this world, how would you really use nudge ethically in the business and not suffer from that conundrum where people say, you know what, you have used it for a completely wrong purpose?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, Raj. And, you know, I mean, I'm sort of in my 50s, and, you know, the team broadly is about age sort of 20, 27, all postgraduates. So all behavioral scientists. So I have a real responsibility to build a business and write the rules in the right way, I guess. And I think a lot of nudges within government are incredibly ethical. So I think questions sometimes get sort of it's put more to the private sector, which is where we tend to work within businesses. And I suppose the question that we get asked is, is nudging ethical? And I think we're very, very clear is to say, you know, the art and practice of nudging can be ethical, but it can equally be unethical. And so it's the same as kind of like taxation system, medicine, law, you know, in the hands of an unscrupulous sort of practice, you know, then yeah, it can be used that way. So we adopt kind of a three P process, if you like. So the first one is hiring the right types of people. So, you know, if someone came into the business that was determined to essentially make lots of money and disadvantage other people, then clearly they might not be the right people for us. So our values around care and integrity are really important. So the personal people values of the people that we recruit into our organisation are really, really important. The second are principles. So if you have a look on our website, we've got our ethical framework on there. So we nudge for good. You know, we look for positive outcomes for colleagues within employee space, or positive outcomes for customers. And then what we look to do is essentially have some, I suppose, checks and balances and subscribe to the regulations in the market. So what's really interesting is the FCA have a behavioural science team, and we follow their guidelines and guardrails. Ofgem in utilities, gas, electricity and broader utilities have their own regulator. Again, they're providing really, really good recommendations about how to practice behavioural science. And then recently, I think Competition and Markets Authority have really, really stepped up some of their thinking in this area as well, about predominantly how retail does it. And then some of you, I mean, I'm pretty close to it, but in California, they've just started to ban what's called dark patterns. And dark patterns are essentially where predominantly in sort of websites and apps where people would use unscrupulous, unethical nudges to essentially get people to, I suppose, buy things that they might not be in their best interest. You know, and a classic one that I think everyone will be familiar with, which I personally think should be outlawed, is when you go onto an airline website and it tells you that there are 3 seats left at this price. Now, the way they manage their yield is there might be 200 seats at another price, but they've only got 3 seats at that price. So they might have 200, which is just like £1 more. And that for me is information asymmetry. I don't think that's particularly helpful in terms of nudging people. However, if there was realistically, if there was only 4 seats left on that flight and they were at the same price, there is inherent bias in that. So there is a scarcity bias within that fact, but it is a fact. And I think that is useful, you know, if you did want to fly, if we could, to go to New York and there was only 4 seats left on that flight, then you'd kind of like to know that, and that might help you book. And I think that's I think our approach. So yeah, so I think there's been some comments that yeah, I think that kind of sympathise with that. The practice itself isn't unethical, but of course, like a lot of things, it can be used unethically.
So, Jez, that brings me to another dimension. If you look at international businesses, you know, they work across cultures, countries with different kind of value systems, different kind of histories, pedigrees, and whatnot.
Yeah.
How would you go about leveraging behavioral science at a scale in a large global business, which is cross-spanning multiple cultures, multiple behavior patterns, multiple histories, and multiple level of maturities in democracy itself?
Yeah, I mean, it is a really, really good point. I think that behavioural science is, I suppose, on that adoption curve. So I think we've seen kind of like the first decade, if you like, 2010 to 2020, where I think the policy teams within the UK, US, Australia are really, really got to grips with how they can start to nudge people around taxation, healthcare systems, and some social care. So I think that's really, really good. I think the next 10 years is beginning to understand the cross-cultural differences, because around, we don't know every paper, but around 90% of all the psychological broader behavioural science papers are predominantly from weird markets. So there's an acronym that we use within our sphere, which is WEIRD, which is Western educated, industrialised, rich and democratic nations, predominantly global north, not exclusively, but predominantly global north. And then non-WEIRD is obviously global south, but not predominantly a developing market. So there's that split. So we're now beginning to understand that, it's very, very different in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Pacific Islands, maybe in Brazil or Argentina. It's to shoot. Or it is to, in university, or it is in LSE or UCL, where predominantly a lot of the studies have been done. So how you should deliver it within business is having a real focus for a global approach, but with a lot of local context and domain dependent expertise. So we're very, very fortunate. We're plugged into a behavioural science network of over sort of 18 organisations, 250 practitioners that can bring to life exactly some of those themes. And so yeah, I think sort of 5-10 years ago, people seemed to think that everybody would behave the same as the UK and the US, and it's just not true.
Jez, that brings me also to the other point in terms of practical examples. How, as you know, our audience is mostly directors of companies of various size, various sectors. Would you please share some examples how business leaders have used behavioral science ethically and successfully? Not the practitioners like you, but the leaders themselves. How have they used it with the help from, of course, scientists like you?
Yeah. I mean, so I'll give you kind of one really kind of fun example, I guess, that myself and April talk about in the book. And one maybe which is more topical. So the first one, which is slightly more fun, was we were working with a construction company, and what they were looking to do was, I suppose, be pioneering in the area of behavioural safety. So essentially, in the UK and again in sort of maybe more sort of high level construction projects, the safety levels are really quite high, so there's not really any deaths, but what there often is like small sort of slips, trips and falls where people might break an arm or break a leg, and the incident itself has to be recorded, and that recording goes like on a register. So when you tender for business, you have to say how many RIDDORs, how many of these recorded incidents you've had. So if you can imagine a particular tender for an £80 million construction project, if you've got two companies that are really quite close together, and then one's got a really bad record of behavioural safety and one's got a really good one, then chances are that might be your tipping point. So one of the directors of Overbury, which is part of the Morgan Sindall Group, the fit-out company, they were fitting out the Shell building on the South Bank, and we helped them essentially get to a new level of safety. And the observations, without going into too much of the detail on the psychology, is that predominantly it was young males that were working on the construction site because they were ripping things out and putting things up. So that was, I suppose, the audience. And what we found was that they had high levels of high appetite for risk, born out of their age really and their gender. Testosterone was coursing through their brains, and they were taking sort of risks. So it might be if they were building a platform to get to a certain height, they might not lock the wheels or lock the gate, and that might mean that chances are they might fall off and break a leg. So what we did is we looked at how we might calm them down and how we might use nudge theory to change their behaviour. And we did a few things. One was we changed their reward system to make it more of a social reward system for them and their team, but we also redesigned their canteen. And it was horrible, their canteen. You wouldn't want to be in there. It was just really awful, not invested in. It had loads of health and safety messages and don't do this, do this. Nobody looked at it. So we took all those messages off the wall and we painted the walls pink, but a particular type of pink. It was called drunk tank pink, which has been evidence in psychology in the early 60s and then used in America in 70s, 80s and 90s. And this kind of colour of pink essentially is received through our visual system and then starts to change, I suppose, how we behave, and through psychology and then physiology. But essentially it calms us down and lowers our levels of testosterone, and lowers our appetite for risk. So we did 3 interventions all at the same time. We don't think the pink walls are maybe the strongest. We think actually it was the social reward system that we think hypothesized would be, but we saw a minus 82% reduction in these low level unsafe behaviors, so 82%. And the statistical significance on that was 1 in 69. So the probability it would be due to chance was kind of as high level as the current academic standards. So that's kind of an example of how you might do it in like a quite physical labor environment. Topical one, myself and April spent a lot of time sort of working in COVID with our pensions providers. And during COVID, obviously the FTSE and quite a lot of the markets took a tumble. So, you know, 20, 30% in some cases. And what was really interesting was the natural instinctive reaction of the human brain is to essentially take your money out of what it's currently in terms usually predominantly equities if you're looking to grow your pension, and put it into safe things like cash or cash-like funds. And that's the exact opposite of what you want to do if you've got a medium to long-term plan. Because if you're in cash or cash-like funds, the chance of that growing in the future is maybe not necessarily going to bounce back to where it was before in terms of where the equity sat. So myself and April did a lot of work essentially sort of coaching customers, mentoring customers to say actually the situation might be that you might want to keep it where it is because it's got the best chance of recovering rather than moving into safer, potentially cash-like funds right now. So they're 2 examples, I think. One quite fun, one quite topical. I know we've had some questions about it, so happy to take them now. If you want to do them at the end, Raj, kind of up to you.
We will pick it up in sequence. So yes, I will pick up those questions as well. But before I go to the audience questions, I have 1 or 2 more things to quickly ask you. One is, if more of our leaders in this audience wants to start using behavioral science, what will be the best place for them to start, like a novice, not really like a behavioral sciences specialist?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're finding is inside and outside. And I think creating your own behavioral science center of excellence or your own nudge unit is increasingly popular within organizations. And then accelerating that through outside consultancies, obviously like ours, but some of the really good ones as well. So they've all got slightly different flavors. So I think that's a combination of kind of inside and outside. So I don't know, April, if you've got anything else that you'd like to add maybe on that.
Yeah, I mean, it can seem like quite an overwhelming thing, you know, like where do you begin when there's this whole world of, I mean, there's a lot out there. I think at our last count, there were maybe 300 plus individual biases that you could use to shape people's behavior. And the thing that we talk about in the very first chapter of Ripple is all about how you bring behavioral science to life for people on a personal level. So we deliberately had that as the very first chapter because we believe that's the very first step that you probably need to go on if you want to start using behavioral science in your organization. And the reason for that is that it's very easy to kind of say, well, this stuff applies to other people, but I'm very clever and it's not going to apply to me. Or, you know, it might work in that other company, but we're different. That's what that's what we hear businesses saying time to time. You know, our people are a little bit different. And so what's wonderful about bringing it to life for people and saying, look, this stuff actually applies to you too, you're not immune to this, is that then it's very hard to deny that it does affect all of us. So there are lots of different ways you can do that. The example that we talk about in chapter 1 of Ripple, we tell the story of how Jez was launching a new behavioral science practice in Ogilvy, the advertising agency, and he ran a series of quite cheeky experiments to bring it to life for people in the business. So it was all centered around the theme of rabbits because it was the Chinese year of the rabbit. And some of them aren't very PG, which I won't go into here. You can read you can read the book for the non-PG ones. But one of them was about nudging people to eat more carrots in the canteen. So, you know, eating like rabbits. So there were things, you know, about how where the carrots were placed, the carrots were earlier in the queue rather than at the end. The sign that was advertising the carrots, we changed, the wording had been changed on them, and a series of 4 little experiments like that, all rolled up into a video, was then played back to the whole business. And, you know, suddenly people could see themselves in it and see, oh yeah, that stuff applies to me too. So that's a really, really good place to start. It could be running a small experiment. It could be just sending an email which has some nudges in it out to the whole business and see if it makes a difference to the behaviours people take off the back of it. At Cowrie, what we do is begin every new relationship with a client with a quiz, which is quite a cheeky quiz, which is designed to catch everyone out, basically. So we ask people a series of 6 questions that we know they're going to get wrong because of these mental shortcuts that we all have. And then at the end, we kind of reveal that the people who thought that they got all the answers right actually got none of them right. And so then after that, it's quite hard to deny that this stuff actually applies to you as well. So that can be quite a powerful place to start.
I've got a question from Martin. Martin is asking, what about TV advertising for gambling? It's around the ethical angle, please.
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, Jez and I both were in the world of advertising and media agencies before coming to applied behavioural science. And yeah, I often think about it when you see a gambling ad come on in the break during a football match. I'm not watching football, but my fiance is. It seems questionable, and the reason from a behavioural science point of view is that we have these different states that we're in, right? So we can be in a cold state, which is when we don't want to gamble. We know that we want to keep our money. We don't want to bet on an uncertain outcome. Or we can be in a hot state, which is when in the middle of the football match, when we really want to place that bet. And what Monzo have done, which is really interesting, which you guys may have heard of, is that they've introduced these really interesting gambling blocks that you can put on yourself. And they're basically using this psychology of this hot, cold empathy gap that we have. So what they're letting their users do is they're saying, look, when you're in a cold state, you can tell us that you want us to put a block on this spending, so that when you're in a hot state, you can still place a bet, but what you have to do is you have to call up our customer service and get them to take that block off. So I think that's a really nice example of what they're doing there. They're using their understanding of behavioural science and how we make decisions in these hot and cold states to actually help their customers make better decisions. I don't know if you've got anything to build on that, Jez.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when we've worked in advertising agencies before, you know, the advertising agency, you know, in liaison with the regulator, makes a decision whether they think it's appropriate for them to advertise that particular brand or service. But at Cowrie, we chatted to our people, as I said, part of our ethical practice, and our people don't want to work on gambling brands. So we won't use nudge theory or behavioural science working with gambling brands. It's our decision. Not saying it's wrong necessarily to do it, but it's not right for our business. Yeah, I think is a good example. But you know, I think we are happy to work on alcohol brands, food and drink brands. You know, I think trying to help people manage consumption is something that's really, really important for a lot of these products and services for the future. So I don't want a world without chocolate. I just want managed chocolate, better packaging, better kind of promotion that allows us to understand sort of how and when we should eat these things. And we're starting to see some of those things. So yeah, again, from some of the better businesses.
So Jez, you definitely have a long career, and I'm sure there's a long one ahead as well. But have you ever been pushed to the limit where you said, you're almost at a dilemma what to do and what not to do yourself on behavioral science assignment for a client.
I mean, not with the clients that we've worked with. So I think there's a misperception, I think sometimes from people in academia and public sector, that everybody in an organization in business that you work in is driven completely by shareholder value. I think that was true maybe, like you said, 20 years ago. Some of the briefs that we got 20 years ago were, how can we get children to pester their parents to buy them sweets? That used to be on a brief 20 years ago. But that isn't on the brief now. And because people understand the impact that sugar has on our societies. So we need, if you've got a good sustainable business, then you need to address that. So not in the businesses that we work with. So going through the due diligence of trying to understand what the potential business that you could work with is trying to do and what their motivations are is kind of a two-way thing, I think, for us. Yeah, so I don't think we've ever had that. I think sometimes unknowingly, I think it happens that people might say, how about we do this? And then we say, actually, that might lead to this unintended consequence or this particularly poor outcome for a colleague or for a customer. And they go, oh, right, yeah, I never thought of it that way. And that's part of our process, that we have kind of those checks and balances to say what potentially could happen as a result of making this change. So yeah, I think it's more about education with the organizations that we work with. So we have an academy that trains, huge organizations in the foundation levels of behavioral science and expert level, and then we handhold them as practitioners. So yeah, I think a shared language in education is really, really important to make sure that people are using this stuff properly and ethically.
I have a question which is almost shared with two of my audiences. One is Andy Hollingworth and Martin again. The question is around, please could you share an example of the social rewards you put in place in the construction example that you gave earlier?
Yeah, I think April, do you want to talk about that, the gold card?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, as Jez said, there were these 3 different interventions, and one of them was how about we reward people for good behaviour on site. So what they had in place, to kind of come back to chatting about football, my favourite subject, is they had this red card system where they, like on the football pitch, they gave people a red card if they'd been behaving badly on the construction site. But we know from psychology that punishing people for bad behaviour, so using that stick, isn't necessarily as effective as rewarding them for good behaviour, so kind of giving them that carrot. So we took away that red card system and we replaced it with a gold card reward system. So everyone had their very own gold card. It had their name on it. It said exactly how long they'd been a member of the scheme since, and basically they get to keep onto that gold card until they do something bad. So until they're seen to cut some corners on site in the kind of safety protocol. And the reason that was so effective is because of this principle of loss aversion. So I'm sure you guys will have heard of loss aversion. It's basically this idea that we feel losses twice as much as we do the equivalent gain. So losses feel really, really painful. So by saying, like, this is your gold card and it's yours to lose, that's more motivating than saying, I will give you something if you do something well. And the kind of the way rewards came into that scheme was that we had this this lottery draw. So anyone who had the gold card at the end of the week were entered into a lottery to win a bigger prize. And the crucial thing there, from a psychological point of view, was that they didn't know what that was going to be. So one week it could be a big plasma TV, and the next week it could be bacon butties for your whole team. So it didn't matter about the value of the reward. It was about the fact that you didn't know what was coming. And so there have been loads of studies. The seminal ones are on kind of pigeons, how random variable rewards, so you don't know when the reward's coming and you don't know how big it's going to be, it's far more effective in driving good behaviours than predictable rewards. So if we know what's coming, it becomes pretty boring pretty quickly. But if we don't know what's coming and when, we find that it's the reward system in our brain finds that incredibly addictive. So yeah, one to use if you're trying to drive behavior change amongst your children. Maybe I can't speak from experience, but I can imagine that giving them the same reward every week would quickly become pretty boring, but surprising them with tiny things one week and bigger things the other week is really powerful, changing our behavior.
Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, the final point was, if you had a gang of electricians working as like a three person team, if I lost my sort of gold card, then April and Raj would lose theirs too. So actually the reinforcement of that kind of amazing variability was kind of done within team. So everyone was saying, look, can we all just do like Raj and April? Can we make sure we're good this week? So I want to get a chance to win a holiday, rather than actually, can we cut corners and maybe do this a bit quicker and clock off at 3 o'clock?
I have a question coming from Benjamin Drury. It is around, why do some organizational leaders fail to see the significance or the impact of looking after employees and creating safe psychological environments?
Yeah, I mean, what we're finding, and again, it's an emergent theme, is that we were initially using behavioral science on customer experience, and that might be corporate or kind of like advisor or end sort of consumer, if you like. But when we started to figure out was that you needed to create a really good employee experience to deliver that customer experience. And so what we are seeing is that it is shifting. So that shift to make sure that you've got a psychologically safe, but also kind of I suppose not just safe, but just a good context for the right sorts of behaviours is really important. And I think we mentioned a little bit earlier, we do a lot of work in contact centres. So essentially just making sure that the experience of people working in a remote environment is a really good one. So that might be how they interact with their team, how they might be able to challenge and change things and have that psychologically sort of safe environment where they might start to improve on a collaborative sense, but also as well just making sure that they've got the right types of sort of interactions, I guess. And so I think we are seeing movement in that area. You know, the chief people officer is now becoming one of our key clients. It used to be like operations, sales, marketing, innovation, but we're now finding that yeah, chief people officer. So I think, April, you've done some work recently in a utilities company doing some work in this area around, I suppose, progression and performance.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to build on what Jez is saying is that all of the things that psychological safety improve for a business, you know, things like creativity, innovation, risk taking, because they don't have any clear commercial link necessarily, it becomes harder to make that case for spending the budget there. But as Jez said, it's when you invest in the colleague experience that the customer experience and then the business metrics then follow. And yeah, Jez is right. We've been working with the people team at a big energy company on how we kind of we design a better people management process. So kind of baking psychology into everything to do with the reviews process, rewards, feedback, setting goals and stuff like that. And something that they were really interested that we look at actually when we did that piece of work was the behavioural science of diversity and inclusion. And I see that we've got another question in the chat about that. So I'm sorry, I'm doing your job for you, Raj. But
Just don't take it away.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a really interesting one for behavioural science. And I mean, to take a kind of obvious example, when it comes to hiring and reading a CV, we know that people don't just read the stuff that's directly applicable to how qualified someone is to do a job. You know, everything from the gender of the applicant to the type of name they have to how it's presented will have an impact on how we perceive the whole the whole candidate. So when you kind of strip those things back, then you can start to make judgments that don't have those predictable irrationalities in them, but are a lot more rational.
There's a question which is coming from Chris Thorne, and it is how much overlap does behavioral science have with neuroscience?
Well, the way I would see it is that I mean, we've grappled with this for a while. You know, do we talk about behavioral science? Are we talking about behavioral economics? Are we talking about neuroscience? Are we talking about psychology? And for the purposes of what we're doing, applying behavioral science in the world of business, we see kind of behavioral science as this umbrella term that of which neuroscience kind of falls within and helps to inform. So of course there are loads of really interesting insights that you get from neuroscience that you couldn't get from just observing people's behaviors. So one of my favorite examples of a neuroscience study that I learned about at university was about wine, which, you know, there's no surprises why I was interested in that at university. And what they did was they looked at people's brain. So they were in an fMRI, so they could see which areas had more blood flow. And they looked at the reward center when people were tasting wine in the scanner. And not the best wine tasting experience, I'm sure, but they were kind of getting it through a little tube. And at the same time, they were told how much the wine cost. And unsurprisingly, when people had a wine that they were told was really cheap, the reward centers in their brain weren't lighting up. When they were told they were drinking a really expensive wine, the reward centers were like flashing brightly. And of course, they were just drinking exactly the same wine. So it was just the fact that they thought it was more expensive. They thought they were enjoying it more. So you can apply insights from neuroscience to kind of business context. So the insight there is that people might actually value your product more if it's more expensive.
I have a question coming from Jez and April, but before I start that question, I must put a disclaimer that the question represents the views of our audience, not mine, because it is a very strong statement.
Okay.
But I would not dilute it because otherwise it will...
Yeah, that's cool. That sounds good.
So James is asking, what are you doing in the world of insurance and risk management, and how impactful your work might be for a sector that is, and that is where the word comes, for a sector that is notorious for being guarded and feeling less favorable?
Yeah, I mean, insurance is a big area. So I think there's some areas of insurance which I think the process has, maybe deliberately, maybe unknowingly, has been made incredibly friction-full. So making a claim is really, really difficult. So, so making those processes more frictionless and easier, I think we're going to see more and more and more of that. So, you know, if your flight's cancelled or delayed, you know, there's some insurers that are got things in play where all you need to do is essentially take some type of image of your boarding card, and then it automatically gets paid. You know, that claim's made. You know, so you know, you just take a picture and it's done, because they know that the flight's been cancelled or delayed. They know that you've got it. They know who you are. They've gone the ID check. So I think those sort of things are sort of happening. It throws up some dilemmas that I think are really, really interesting. That's okay on a simple transactional claim, but imagine if you got a particularly protracted, quite difficult. So it might be that you had an existing health condition, you went traveling abroad, you had an incident, a health condition deteriorated, you were in a place for maybe 3 months, and over the course of that, it ran into hundreds of £1,000s worth of health claims. Imagine if you took a picture of something and fired it across and it said, yeah, we're not going to pay out £100,000, we'll pay out 57. You'd be like, yeah, I don't want a transactional process. I want to have a relational one where you actually understand me, understand my conditions, understand what I've been through, take the time to look at the policy. So I think that's quite interesting. So there's a lot of, I suppose, work being done about automation of processes, but also how you humanize those processes, which I think is really interesting. And then the other area is in the area of fraud. that Dan Ariely has done a lot of work in terms of dishonesty. You know, most, I think, if not all of us would say that at some point in our lives we've been dishonest, you know, or we've done something which is unlawful. That might be driving at 34 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour road at some point. And I think that is genuinely sort of interesting about how we might start to help with that. And there was a study done which has recently been tried to replicate, and they've struggled to, which is a common problem in psychology, which is that when they were asking people about their mileage on a form, like how many miles would you do in your car, what they found was if they asked you lots of questions about your driving behaviour, including mileage, and then you had to sign at the end about essentially how, whether it's truthful what you'd entered or not, if they move that signature right to the beginning to say, if you're going to be truthful throughout all of this form, can you sign up front? What they found that the average mileage increased by 11% because in the second option, people were more truthful because they were essentially holding themselves to account. Subsequently, literally, I think in the last sort of 12 months, that's been tried to be replicated, and people have said it might not be quite right. And that is a problem of psychology, that the context of some of the experimentation sometimes may not be exactly the same, so we're not getting exactly the same results. It doesn't mean that it's not true. It might be that the experiments weren't necessarily in exactly the same context, which is pretty complicated. So, but yeah, I think there's loads of work to do in insurance. I think Lemonade are a good spark, good disruptive force in the insurance industry. Dan Ariely is the Chief Behavioural Officer. He's a professor at Duke of Lemonade. So I think they're doing some good stuff. I don't think Lemonade is as revolutionary, I think, as they would have us believe. But certainly I think it's starting to make some changes, which is good. Thank you.
You brought a very nice point about honesty and dishonesty. And frankly, when I was similar age group of basically, April, I was in oil and gas. And one of my chief engineers always used to say that honesty is a threshold game. You could be very honest in 100 quid, and you could be extremely dishonest for $1 million. So I will just leave it there. Not that I followed his advice, but I will leave it there. But I've got a question which is coming from Jamila, which you touched upon slightly. Maybe you can go at a different angle this time. She's asking that what does this fit best to start off deploying this thinking in a business to get the business adopting it, not implementing it. So it's a slightly different question.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, because you're absolutely right, Jamila, that there are so many places that you could apply behavioural science to help both colleagues and customers, that it's like, well, where do you start? Like, where's the best place to begin? And I think for me, if I was working with you to try and find the best place to start, I would be thinking quite single-mindedly about what's measurable. So the most important thing about this first project will be, can you get a really good proof point to show that this stuff works, so that you can then take it to the rest of the organization and give them some really strong evidence that you should be using it everywhere. So I would think about all the different behaviors that you might want your colleagues or your customers to do. And usually when you're most things like an email, a call to a contact center, or a website, you are trying to drive a certain behavior. Think about which one of those behaviors is linked to a good business outcome, and then focus on changing that. So is it getting people to update their beneficiaries if you are a pension provider? Could we tweak a tiny bit of wording on a call to get people to do that? Can we measure that? And then once you've got that in place, that kind of sets you up for a really good first pilot that you can then take to the rest of the business. So I would think about that. I would think about what's a measurable behavior that you can change that is linked to a good outcome for the business.
I have a very quick, most probably a short question for you before I try to go to the closing round of this session. And that is around which is the best functional area, in the business where you will put behavioral science, expertise into, if it is an internal capability?
I mean, I think as business leaders, I think, often we get involved in the strategic decisions and direction, and sometimes, not always, lose touch with the coalface. So that, so I would say, the points of organization that touch your customers is really, really interesting. And often it's critical to get right. So I think getting that interface right from a very much a bottom-up perspective, I think is critical. So often that might be your customer service, and I think, we do a lot of work in contact centers, and I think it's really good practice for CEOs. So she might go to the floor of the contact center and work remotely and listen into those things. It's really, really important that you understand what your customers are going through right now, and help the people that are helping them. I think that can really make a big difference, which is a very different approach from maybe some consultancies that tend to be more top down. But we takes a bit longer, but we bring the organization with us from the bottom up, and it's really, really rewarding and fulfilling to make people's lives, jobs better. So yeah, I think that would be our advice.
So April and Jez, that's all we had the time for today. We are now getting into the end of this session. Just to request our audiences, if you don't mind, please turn your video on, and we will then bring you for a group photo. While we are doing that, just to let you know that our next conversation series will be in April. And in April, we'll be talking to, I don't know, you should know about him, it's John Kay, the leading UK economist and very good colleague of Sir Mervyn King. So I'm delighted to let you know that on 27th of April, we will be hosting John Kay around his book, which is Greed is Dead, Politics After Individualism. So that will be a very fascinating topic. I would now request you to come on video so that I can take a picture for all of you, which will come back to you from Julie as a souvenir. I don't know whether that souvenir is worth something for you or not, but definitely it's worth a lot for us. So while I do that, please make sure that you mark your diaries for 27th of April to listen to John Kay. And with this, April and Jez, thank you very much for your time and your lovely conversation. And I would like to thank our lovely audience who make it very interesting. And without them, this conversation was neither having a heart nor having a soul. So thank you very much for being very patient. Thank you for giving your time as well. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot for being here. And with this, I will try to bring this conversation to a close. Have a lovely morning and a fantastic working day ahead. Thank you. We will be staying back after this for the conversation, for the networking discussion. So those who want to stay back for the networking, please do stay back, and we will continue the networking after this. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.